All right, good evening. Hello, zoology people. Here to finally begin lecturing now on our Osteichthyes. So, oh man, this is going to be a big group. I'm going to try to do it some justice, but there's just so much material to cover. We could lecture on Osteichthyes, these ray finned fish, what we call the bony fish. I could spend 2 semesters talking about these and not even get, through everything I need to cover. So to do it in just a few little lectures, again, I'm not going to do it justice, but I do want to introduce the group. I want to kind of talk a little bit about some common species, some of the ecology associated with this group, and their evolutionary position in the sort of the phylogeny of the vertebrates here, right? So if you recall, we left off with the Chondrichthyes, the cartilaginous fish, cartilage endoskeleton. There's some sort of fossilized, again, intermediary type species in categories. The Canthodians that basically are no longer with us, but there's some branches that kind of led up then to the ossification of the endoskeleton. So the formation instead of cartilage, but now sort of calcium phosphate bone in the endoskeleton. So two groups that we're going to get to. First, I'll talk about sort of these sort of ray fin fish, and I'll give you some technical terms in a bit, and then the lobe fins fish as well. So giving you a time scale, kind of, you can see way back when, sort of this Devonian, pre-Devonian sort of lineages and branches that we start to see these groups. So again, Osteichthyes, a literal translation, bone, oste, pertaining to bone, and then ichthyes, again, the literal translation that means fish. So Greek language, Osteichthyes, the bony fish. Why bony fish? Because they have a calcium phosphate endoskeleton. So it's a skeleton similar to what we would have in humans, as opposed to the cartilaginous endoskeleton of the sharks. Also a characteristic of all of them, although highly modified and very, very distinctive in all of the groups here, is the presence of some sort of swim bladder. If you recall, the sharks utilized a very oily liver to give them buoyancy, right? To help them stay up higher in that water column. So these fish, their skeleton is different, but they have basically the challenge to stay buoyant as well. So they're going to accomplish that in various ways with the swim bladder. We also have then this bony plate that's going to protect the gills. So the gills are the respiratory organ for this fish. So they need then that protective bony plate. And if you've ever eaten fish or you've gone fishing, I suspect that you're familiar with that sort of operculum, this sort of bony plate, bony protective layer on the external surface of those gills that can flex, also can generate sort of a suction of water, a movement of water across the gills. So provides protection and then helps to aerate those gills as well. And this is going to differ from group to group, but collectively, these bony fish are going to have different types of economic importance. A lot of the species that you eat for food are going to come or be part of this Osteichthyes category, right? For pets, if you have aquariums, a goldfish, a betta fish, these nice, real pretty saltwater tanks. If you spend money to go fishing, you buy a fishing license, fishing rods. So there's again economic significance to the category, the Osteichthyes. And again, it's going to vary individually from species to species, but we're looking right now at that sort of that overall group. So showing you kind of a diagram here of the swim bladder. So the swim bladder, again, is going to vary from the primitive fish to more advanced teleos fish that have modifications in this bladder, but think of it like when you were learning how to go swimming, you had those little floaties on maybe the arm floaties, or a little like a little life jacket floaty, something like that. It provides a hollow space that's filled with air, and that allows buoyancy. That makes it easier for the fish. They don't have to expend as much energy trying to swim. They just inflate that swim bladder with air, and it helps them move up or down the water column. If you've seen goldfish, sometimes you see them come and gulp air, and then you'll see them like burp out little bubbles of air. They're inflating and deflating that swim bladder, allowing them to move up or down in the water column without expending much energy. So it's a good adaptation. It just helps them to survive. And they are a very, very successful, very, very large category of fish, these bony fish. Early on in the phylogeny, we start to see a big distinction of a big phylogenetic branch, a big anatomical distinction between these two groups. So Osteichthyes are going to be broken into two large categories, right? We're going to call the Actinopterygii. And again, a lot of weird names I'm going to throw out your way this lecture. And the Sarcopterygii. So these are literal translations, right? So it means something, right? So actino kind of refers to these rays, like a sun ray, like a ray of light, something like that. And then the Sarcopterygii are going to be these lobed or boned appendages here. So you can see that big branch here, where the fins then are going to have these little sort of rays, what we call ray fins. There's flexion, the ulna and the radius, which humans have. It's basically your forearm would be here. And then on the lobed fin fish, the ulna is separate from the radius. And we have just a very, very different formation, different structural, anatomical structure of the fin itself. So lobed fin fish, and then the ray finned fish over here. So the picture is going to be reversed here. So we have the ray fin fish on the left, and then the lobed fin fish on the right. So just different artistic diagrams that they're trying to show you some of the anatomical differences. So I'm going to present these first, and then in another lecture later, I'll cover then the lobed fin fish. So just again, giving you a little evolutionary history lesson here. So we had these old groups of fish. These are, again, parts of these bony fish, the Osteichthyes, or precursors to the Osteichthyes. The placoderms, covered in these bony plates. The acanthodians, these still kind of spiky, spiny fish. And then we get into our two categories, the ray fin fish and lobed fin fish. And we're going to sound technical here, right? Like we're learning something. We talk about the Actinopterygians and the Sarcopterygians. Right? So the ray finned fish, and the lobe fin fish. Again, the lobe fin fish. So different skeletal derivatives of those fins. So let's look first at this category. It's very, very diverse. Lots of species to look at here. So same kind of information, just portrayed differently here. We have the extinct versions here. That primitive branch, or it's that's not technically correct to say. It's just it's a branch off of this lineage, and I'll talk about why primitive is not necessarily a good term. But again, we have a branch that's our Sarcopterygians, the lobe fin fish, and then if you notice here in green, all these Actinopterygians, all these green, all these that fall under that green category. So we have, again, the Polypteriformes, the Chondrostii, Neopterygii. So again, lots of different names. So a lot of things is part of the vocabulary for this chapter. Right? And I'm going to address each of these categories individually here. So the gars, the amias, the teleost fish. So we'll address all of these individuals. This one is just trying to show us just even more characteristics. So basically contrasting the ray fin fish within the branch that we call the lobe fin fish. So this lecture, I'm going to push to the end of this chapter. So I'm not going to follow necessarily the book word for word. I'm going to kind of hop and skip, and I'm going to get to all the important aspects of the material, but maybe in a slightly different sequence that what you're going to read in the book there. But hopefully it'll make sense. I'll try to make it as concise and as fluid as possible. So lots of names here, right? So looking at the Actinopterygii, right? So starting here, this little green frame. So these names are going to start to become familiar. If you notice where it says Iformes, Polypteriformes, Lepisostiformes, and these kind of break the rule, but we're kind of talking at this level, this category. So we talk about the Polypteriformes, A and B, Chondrostii, C, D, Neopterygii, and then Teleostii. So we're looking at different variations. I'm going to address each one of these individually here. So as I talk about the different groups, I'm going to bring up variations on scales, and different types of scales pertain to different groups of these fish. So I want to introduce this now. So if I say the words later, you kind of know what I'm talking about. So one of these scales should already be familiar to you. One of these scale types should already be familiar to you. Right? We've talked about placoid scales. These are characteristics of the chondrichthyes, of the sharks, right? That hydrodynamic type of scale structure, right? So placoids, we don't really see in the Osteichthyes. It's a variation, different type of scales that have evolved, right? So I'm going to talk about ganoid scales. These are basically like armor plates, very, very thick, very dense, very tightly compacted together to give the fish like an armor plating, but at the cost of being heavy, right? Makes the fish very heavy, and then therefore going to have an energetic expenditure associated with it. Not going to be something that swims necessarily a lot, right? It would be not in the best interest, not the best hydrodynamic type of scale. We have other types of scales that you may be a little bit familiar with. If you go fishing and you catch a bass, you have to like scrape off the little scales. They're protective, but they're not going to be as dense, and we're going to call these ctenoid scales. Right? They look like a little brush. That's what a ctenoid is, like a comb, a little brush or comb shape, and they kind of overlap in that fashion there. So ctenoid scales, and then we have some fish that have these cycloid scales. So different scale types that I might mention: cycloid, ctenoid, or ganoid scales, right? We're not going to hear about placoid scales within the Osteichthyes category. And now I'm stuck. What happened? All right, there we go. So Osteichthyes. So lots of diversity. We know we have the ray fin fish and then the lobe fin fish. This is going to be the first category of the, again, the Actinopterygii group. Right? And this is kind of a new term. I never knew, or I never learned this term when I learned this stuff way back in the day, cladistia. So I'm not going to use that term much. It's just I'm not familiar with that taxonomical term. I'm more familiar with this term here, right? The Polypteriformes. And basically, these are really, really interesting fish. They're kind of primitive fish. Um, their aquarium, you can have these as pets, tanks. I don't know if you really have fish as pets, but they're going to be these elongated forms, right? So the bishir, they call it, right? The bishir fish, reed fish. These are freshwater fish. And this is kind of interesting because they're going to use lungs to supplement gill respiration. Remember that swim bladder we talked about? Well, this primitive fish type uses it actually as a supplement to the gills. So if the gills aren't getting enough oxygen in water, they can then use this air sac, this little swim bladder, then to supplement and provide a little bit of extra oxygen for them. So that tells you that they can survive for at least brief periods, maybe a little bit slightly extended periods on land, as long as they stay relatively moist. But interesting fish. I will have some YouTube video links associated with these later on throughout the discussion of these chapters. Heavy-bodied little predators because of those dense scales that they have as well. So neat little fish. And with that, yeah, let me stop this first video here. Then I want to get into some other discussions on the remaining fish, right? So let me get this stopped now so it doesn't get too long.